Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is, for all intents and purposes, we'll call it Monday, August 2nd for this one. I have yet to decide what order most of these things are going to go in and even introduce you to exactly what we're doing with these things, because I don't know exactly what we're doing, and I don't know how often we'll be doing it either. But I know what's going to happen today, because a story broke on Friday that I just knew we would be talking about come Monday, if we were on the air. But, there was some possibility, I think, that over the weekend, more developments could end up outpacing these things. Sometimes what looks like the obvious story for Monday is, by Monday, if it breaks on Friday, old news. I don't know whether that'll be the case in this one, but you will have read this one yourself, I'm sure, over the weekend. I'm talking, of course, about the news about the notes that high-ranking Justice Department officials apparently took, and which are now in the hands of the House Government Oversight Committee members, and, of course, also in the hands of the newspaper reporters, in which notes on meetings with Donald Trump are taken, in which I guess he gives the direction that they are to simply declare the election to have been corrupt and, as he says, leave the rest to me and to the Republican allies I have in Congress. So what I ended up doing originally was I had just sat down with the things, and I didn't think to work in the intro music and the outro music and all of that. And so I've now gone back and backfilled this. So essentially what you'll be doing at this point is rejoining the show with my thoughts already in progress. So you'll have to excuse the strange transition. Otherwise, I'd be up all night trying to figure out how to actually segue into this thing. So what I've got is some tape to roll of my read through of the stories and the comments and things, whatever thoughts, wherever it takes me. And yeah, that'll be the format, by the way, for much of the break time. I'm sure there'll be probably some interspersed reruns as well, but the decision here at headquarters was to simply go with the theme, get to the stories that you thought you wanted to share and never found the time for, read them, and however long it takes, well, that's how long the show is. So here comes the first one. Hope it works out for you, and I'll see you again at the end. Well, ordinarily, if we were back on the air, we would almost certainly be talking about this story, which broke on Friday during our last live show, and it might have been a big topic of discussion on the following Monday. Of course, developments over the weekend may outpace this thing, but I want to read through the piece myself. I thought, basically, I'd invite you to join me, and we'll see what comes of reading through the New York Times story, which reveals in its headline, Trump pressed Justice Department to declare elections result corrupt, notes show. You all know it by now, I'm sure. Leave the rest to me and to congressional allies, the former president is said to have told top law enforcement officials. Katie Benner is the author of this piece, like I said, published on Friday, July 30th. President Donald J. Trump pressed top Justice Department officials late last year to declare that the election was corrupt, even though they had found no instances of widespread fraud, so that he and his allies in Congress could use the assertion to try to overturn the results, according to new documents provided to lawmakers and obtained by the New York Times. I guess before I get too far afield in it, I just wanted to point out that familiar formulation of things that I guess is the hedge against being absolutist about these things. When they say, remember here that officials had found no instances of widespread fraud. That keeps getting used as like, you don't say they found no instances of fraud, because they did find instances of fraud. Although it is interesting that the instances of fraud that they keep finding are pro-Trump fraud. And I assume maybe somewhere there's something that you could claim was pro-Biden fraud, and that somebody who wasn't entitled to vote but did vote and voted for Joe Biden, I guess Republicans would point to as, well, that's evidence of fraud. But they say, well, it's not widespread enough fraud to cause a change in the outcome. And I guess clearly pro-Trump fraud wasn't widespread enough to change the outcome either. But I don't know. At some point, I'm getting fed up with that formulation. It's like, well, yeah, we didn't find widespread fraud anywhere, but we did find isolated pockets of fraud. And while it might even be true that there were isolated pockets of fraud that benefited both candidates, it seems to me like the vast majority of the isolated pockets of fraud are pro-Trump instances of fraud. And it doesn't make any sense to try to include that in the article or anything. I'm just saying. I mean, I'm going to read you an article about an attempted coup, so I don't know. I thought I would throw in a little item like that. We'll continue here. The demands were an extraordinary instance of a president interfering with an agency that is typically more independent from the White House to advance his personal agenda. They are also the latest example of Mr. Trump's wide-ranging campaign during his final weeks in office to delegitimize the election results. No attention, of course, paid to tamping down on the coronavirus pandemic, and that's why we are where we are. Anyway, the exchange unfolded during a phone call on December 27th, in which Mr. Trump pressed the acting Attorney General at the time, Jeffrey A. Rosen, and his deputy, Richard P. Donahue, on voter fraud claims that the department had disproved. So let's just be clear about that. The department had disproved them, but he wants to move forward with them anyway. And I guess, that becomes important. They do, refuse to agree to do this stuff, but, and we'll read more about that later, but that's very important. Mr. Donahue warned that the department had no power to change the outcome of the election. Mr. Trump replied that he did not expect that, according to notes Mr. Donahue took memorializing the conversation. And my initial read of it is, I'm not 100% sure that it's really what happened, that Trump didn't expect that. I think that's just Trump saying, he's challenged too much, so his MO is to back off a little bit, but then say, but I want you to do me a favor anyway. No, I don't expect that to happen. All I mean is, do the illegal thing I just asked you to do. Okay, so, and the quote that everybody's talking about that's taken from the notes says, just say that the election was corrupt and, like plus sign, so this is handwritten notes, and leave the rest to me and to congressional allies, Mr. Donahue wrote in summarizing Mr. Trump's response. But thanks for the confession. That's really great. I appreciate that. Just say the election was corrupt and I'll do all the rest of the crime. Me and congressional allies. And I think the picture of it says, R's in Congress or congressional R's or whatever it is. And thank you for indicting them in all of this too. That is fantastic. Mr. Trump did not name the lawmakers, but at other points during the call, he mentioned Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, which is why you're not on that committee, you dumbass, whom he described as a fighter. Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, who at the time promoted the idea that the election was stolen from Mr. Trump, and Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, whom Mr. Trump praised for, quote, getting to the bottom of things, which he didn't do. But he's getting to the bottom of the barrel. We know that much. The notes connect Mr. Trump's allies in Congress with his campaign to pressure Justice Department officials to help undermine or even nullify the election results. The lawmakers did not immediately respond to requests for comment. Mr. Jordan ultimately voted to overturn the election results in key states, but has downplayed his role in the president's pressure campaign. Mr. Perry continues to assert Mr. Trump won, but has not been tied directly to the White House effort to keep him in office. And Mr. Johnson, whom Mr. Trump recently endorsed as he weighs whether to seek a third term, maintains that it is reasonable to have questions about the integrity of the election, though he has recognized Joseph R. Biden Jr. as president. The Justice Department provided Mr. Donahue's notes to the House Oversight and Reform Committee, which is investigating the Trump administration's efforts to unlawfully, reverse the election results. Typically, the department has fought to keep secret any accounts of private discussions between a president and his cabinet to avoid setting a precedent that would prevent officials in future administrations from candidly advising presidents out of concern that their conversations would later be made public. We've been over this territory a number of times, and we did so on the last Friday show, but in a slightly different context. But handing over the notes to Congress is part of a pattern of allowing scrutiny of Mr. Trump's efforts to overturn the election. The Biden Justice Department also told Mr. Rosen, Mr. Donahue, and other former officials this week that they could provide unrestricted testimony to investigators with the House Oversight and Reform and Senate Judiciary Committees that we very definitely pointed out on Friday. The department reasoned that congressional investigators were examining potential wrongdoing by a sitting president, an extraordinary circumstance, according to letters sent to the former officials, because executive privilege is meant to benefit the country, rather than the president as an individual. Invoking it over Mr. Trump's efforts to push his personal agenda would be inappropriate, the department concluded. These handwritten notes show that President Trump directly instructed our nation's top law enforcement agency to take steps to overturn a free and fair election in the final days of his presidency, Representative Carolyn B. Maloney, Democrat of New York and chairwoman of the House Oversight and Reform Committee, said in a statement. Mr. Trump's conversation with Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue reflected his single-minded focus on overturning the election results, and it really was single-minded, even to the exclusion of a global pandemic. At one point, Mr. Trump alleged voter fraud in Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona, which he called corrupted elections. Mr. Donahue pushed back. Much of the info you're getting is false, Mr. Donahue said, adding that the department had conducted dozens of investigations, hundreds of interviews, and not found evidence to support his claims. We look at allegations, but they don't pan out, the officials told Mr. Trump, according to the notes. The department found that the error rate of ballot counting in Michigan was 0.0063%, not the 68% that the president asserted, because he's an effing moron. You know what? And it probably was this. He was probably looking at the 0.0063% and thinking, oh yeah, well, but you know how percentages are. Like 68% is really like 0.0068, right? No. First of all, that's 0.0063 for one thing. And secondly, it's 0.0063%, not a rate of 0.0063, which even so would still be a 0.63%, not 68%. If that was just, the result of the math of dividing by 100, you'd get that. So I don't know. This is a constant thing with him. He gets numbers slightly wrong. He sees a 6.3, and because he's half blind, he sees it as a 6.8, and 6.8 is higher anyway. And then he doesn't understand that even 0.68, 6.68% doesn't mean 68%. Okay? But yeah, so he just compounds error upon error upon error. But think about how huge that is. I mean, you can literally say that's what, like order of magnitude of thousands, off by a factor of 1,000, right? Anyway, maybe I've got the math wrong, but the department found that the error rate of ballot counting in Michigan was 0.0063%, not the 68% that the president asserted. It did not find evidence of a conspiracy theory that an employee in Pennsylvania had tampered with ballots. And after examining video and interviewing witnesses, it did not find evidence of ballot fraud in Fulton County, Georgia, according to the notes, and according to everything that exists on the planet. Mr. Trump, undeterred, brushed off the department's findings. Okay, fine, but what about the others? I just said all of your assertions don't pan out. But what about other ones that I might make later? This is why I'm led to believe, or I've come to the conclusion that when they say, well, look, the Justice Department can't and won't overturn an election for you. No, just not happening. Okay, well, I don't expect that. I just expect that you not arrest me when I try to do it, is basically what he's asking for. But, he's just saying it's him backpedaling and then hoping to just take the same 2 steps forward again. All right. Where were we? Yes, right. Okay, Mr. Trump, undeterred, brushed off the department's findings. Okay, fine, but what about the others? Mr. Donahue wrote in his notes describing the president's remarks. Mr. Trump asked Mr. Donahue to travel to Fulton County to verify signatures on ballots. The people, quote, saying that the election isn't corrupt, are corrupt, Mr. Trump told the officials, adding that they needed to act. Not much time left. So, all of the investigations that you've done that show that this doesn't pan out is all based on corrupt stuff. The secret kind. Right? So just go do it. At another point, Mr. Donahue said that the department could quickly verify or disprove the assertion that more ballots were cast in Pennsylvania than there are voters. Should be able to check on that quickly, but understand that the DOJ can't and won't snap its fingers and change the outcome of the election. Doesn't work that way, Mr. Donahue wrote in his notes. The officials also told Mr. Trump that the Justice Department had no evidence to support a lawsuit regarding the election results. We are not in a position based on the evidence. We can only act on the actual evidence developed, they said, right? None of this, well, there's secret evidence to be determined later that we'll have, and then when the time's right, then we'll tell you what the evidence is. But this is really kind of amazing, and this is where he says, up in the short version of the notes, is that's where when Trump says, "Oh, I understand that, but couldn't you just do a little bit, right? Just say that the election's corrupt and I'll handle the rest." And by the way, I'll handle the rest, right? Turned out to be, I will lose 60 lawsuits in a row and get my lawyers disbarred. That's handling the rest. Good job with that. Amazing. Okay, you know how I feel about this. You feel the same way. The officials also told Mr. Trump that the Justice Department had no evidence to support the lawsuit, right? We can only act on the actual evidence developed. Trump castigated the officials, saying that thousands of people called their local U.S. attorney's offices to complain about the election, and nobody trusts the FBI. He said that people are angry, blaming DOJ for inaction. You guys may not be following the internet the way I do, Mr. Trump said, according to the document. And that was a howler. Everybody enjoyed that one on Friday immensely. You might not be following the internet the way I do. Well, that's probably true. I have some inkling of the way you follow the internet. And, let's say it probably has a lot more to do with Stormy Daniels than election integrity. But, when you are following it for purposes of election integrity, I hope nobody's following the internet the way you do. In a moment of foreshadowing, Mr. Trump said, "People tell me Jeff Clark is great. I should put him in," referring to the acting head of the Justice Department's Civil Division, who had also encouraged department officials to intervene in the election. "People want me to replace the DOJ leadership." "You should have the leadership you want," Mr. Donahue replied, "but it won't change the department's position," although I suspect that it might have changed the department's position if he really got what he wanted. It just won't change it now while we're still here. Mr. Donahue and Mr. Rosen did not know that Mr. Perry had introduced Mr. Clark and Mr. Trump. Exactly 1 week later, they would be forced to fight Mr. Clark for their jobs in an Oval Office showdown. And that's linked. We already knew that one, but I might want to review that whole episode at some point. I'll just open that up for my own edification later on. During the call, Mr. Trump also told the Justice Department officials to figure out what to do with what? With Hunter Biden. Just figure it out. Well, we have no evidence of it. We'll figure some out, basically. People will criticize the DOJ if he's not investigated for real, like they did with Kavanaugh, I'm sure, right? He told them, violating long-standing guidelines against the White House interfering in criminal investigations or other law enforcement actions. Although I will say it's really rather remarkable. And I'm glad we have these notes and everything, but like in terms of, well, is Donahue a big hero here or what? I guess I would point out he just took notes. He took notes on an MF criminal conspiracy, and then he walked away with them. I mean, he gave them up when they were asked for by the committee, and that's great. But what did he do with them in the meantime? He just sat there, and the president crimed like crazy to the Justice Department. And they were like, well, if anybody asks, I guess I'll tell them. Later, 6 months down the road, I suppose. He should have waited. He should have written a book. That's what everybody else is doing. All right. 2 days after the phone call with Mr. Trump, Mr. Donahue took notes of a meeting between Justice Department officials. Mr. Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, and White House Deputy Counsel Patrick Philbin to discuss a conspiracy theory. Oh my God, they really talked about this? A conspiracy theory known as Italy-gate, which asserts without evidence, which is big deal in the Justice Department. They usually only discuss things with evidence. Without evidence that people in Italy used military technology of some kind. Who in Italy? People. And they used military technology, like, what do you mean, military? That's like very advanced, very strong technology. Military, they say military grade, the technology was. Well, people in Italy use military technology to remotely tamper with voting machines in the United States. Why do it from here when you can do it from Italy, I guess? I want Chef Boyardee arrested immediately. Okay, right, sure. We'll just get right on that. Oh, my God. Emerald Lagasse should be... Okay. The Justice Department officials... Luciano Pavarotti. Let's just go on forever with this joke. The Justice Department officials told the White House that they had assigned someone to look into the matter, according to the notes and a person briefed on the meeting. Why did you say that? Did you really do it? They did not mention that the department was looking into the theory in order to debunk it, the person said. Well, but, do you need to? I mean, if that's where the facts take you, that's where the facts take you. There's no more to it. And then, as a matter of fact, there's no more to the article. So I guess this is still developing. I wouldn't be surprised if later this afternoon there's even more information being reported about this. But anyway, that was the big blockbuster of Friday afternoon. I thought I'd mention it. And what the hell? We had the opportunity to make a few jokes, too. Maybe that's quite enough on this subject, at least for now. Over the weekend, who knows what's going to explode on this. Well, maybe a good supplement then to this, just to make this, fill this out a little bit more. Let's read that New York Times piece from January 22nd, the piece that was updated, it says here, on June 15th of this year, also by Katie Brenner, the one referred to earlier, the New York Times piece, Trump and Justice Department lawyers said to have plotted to oust acting Attorney General. Trying to find another avenue to push his baseless election claims, Donald Trump considered installing a loyalist. This then about Clark, who was mentioned earlier. The Justice Department's top leaders listened in stunned silence this month. That would have been earlier in January. One of their peers, they were told, had devised a plan with President Donald J. Trump to oust Jeffrey A. Rosen as acting Attorney General and wield the department's power to force Georgia state lawmakers to overturn its presidential election results. I'm not sure whether or not we may have read this article at the time, back in early January or late January. But if so, I don't think it hurts anything to reiterate what was contained therein now, especially alongside what we just read. The unassuming lawyer who worked on the plan, Jeffrey Clark, unassuming, eh? That's an interesting description. Had been devising ways to cast doubt on the election results and to bolster Mr. Trump's continuing legal battles and the pressure on Georgia politicians. Because Mr. Rosen had refused the president's entreaties to carry out those plans, Mr. Trump was about to decide whether to fire Mr. Rosen and replace him with Mr. Clark. He sounds plenty assuming to me. The department officials convened on a conference call, then asked each other, "What will you do if Mr. Rosen is dismissed?" The answer was unanimous. They would resign, but keep their notes secret, or as long as they could, I guess. The informal pact ultimately helped persuade Mr. Trump to keep Mr. Rosen in place, calculating that a furor over mass resignations at the top of the Justice Department would eclipse any attention on his baseless accusations of voter fraud. I don't even know if he could really make that calculus. He'd probably think, that's great, because my accusations, baseless accusations of voter fraud will get investigated, and the outcome of the investigation will be the one I want. I wonder what it was that made him, decide not. I don't even know if I buy that explanation, but okay. All right, maybe. Mr. Trump's decision came only after Mr. Rosen and Mr. Clark made their competing cases to him in a bizarre White House meeting that two officials compared with an episode of Mr. Trump's reality show, The Apprentice, albeit one that could prompt a constitutional crisis. Oh, that is a little different. The previously unknown chapter was the culmination of the president's long-running effort to batter the Justice Department into advancing his personal agenda. He also pressed Mr. Rosen to appoint special counsels, including one who would look into Dominion voting systems, a maker of election equipment that Mr. Trump's allies had falsely said was working with Venezuela to flip votes from Mr. Trump to Joe Biden. Yeah, okay, I remember that theory. And by the way, Dominion Voting Systems has since won a ton of money off of people who have been alleging that incorrectly. And for a while there, the special counsel that he was advocating be named to do that is none other than now disgraced Kraken lawyer, and even then disgraced Kraken lawyer Sidney Powell. Anyway, this account of the department's final days under Mr. Trump's leadership is based on interviews with 4 former Trump administration officials who asked not to be named because of fear of retaliation. I wonder if it's Donahue among them. Mr. Clark said that this account contained inaccuracies, but did not specify, adding that he could not discuss any conversations with Mr. Trump or Justice Department lawyers because of the strictures of legal privilege. Well, now we've found out that many of those strictures of legal privilege have been removed, and he'll be a hostile witness maybe before the January 6th committee at some point, or maybe the department, maybe the government oversight committee might take this one up, or hey, maybe even justice. Senior Justice Department lawyers, not uncommonly, provide legal advice to the White House as part of our duties, he said. All my official communications were consistent with law, which doesn't really actually speak to the question of privilege, but okay. Mr. Clark categorically, and by the way, any of his official communications that involved doing the president's bidding on this and overturning the election results were really not consistent with law. You might as well point that out. Mr. Clark categorically denied that he devised any plan to oust Mr. Rosen or to formulate recommendations for actions based on factual inaccuracies gleaned from the internet. My practice is to rely on sworn testimony to assess disputed factual claims, Mr. Clark said. Of course, they've been circulating garbage affidavits among themselves for quite a long time, and I guess that counts as sworn testimony. It's just not valid or helpful or based on anything or given by anybody who would have been in a position to have actually observed any of the things that they allege. But I digress. That's what the show's about, my digressions, but I do digress. All right. There was a candid discussion of options and pros and cons with the president. It is unfortunate that those who are part of a privileged legal conversation would comment in public about such internal deliberations while also distorting any discussions. Well, they may or may not have distorted the discussions, but as it turns out, they've been borne out in this. It is unfortunate that you couldn't understand the situation well enough to know that it was likely that the department would eventually hold that your conversations were not privileged, in fact, and that you were, in fact, witness to a crime and should have said something. Mr. Clark also noted that he was the lead signatory on a Justice Department request last month asking a federal judge to reject the lawsuit that sought to pressure Vice President Mike Pence to overturn the results of the election. Mr. Trump declined to comment. An advisor said that Mr. Trump has consistently argued that the justice system should investigate, quote, rampant election fraud that has plagued our system for years, though it has not. The advisor noted that any assertion to the contrary is false and being driven by those who wish to keep the system broken. I'm not certain even what he means, like assertion to the contrary. Assertion that it hasn't plagued our system for years, or that there isn't rampant election fraud, or that the Justice Department shouldn't investigate it. But all of those things, any of those things, is clearly driven by those who wish to keep the system broken, even though it's not broken. Mr. Clark agreed and said that the legal privileges, again, prevented him from divulging specifics regarding that conversation. Not anymore, a-hole. A Justice Department spokesman declined to comment, as did Mr. Rosen. When Mr. Trump said on December 14th that Attorney General William P. Barr was leaving the department, some officials thought that he might allow Mr. Rosen a short reprieve before pressing him about voter fraud. After all, Mr. Barr would be around for another week. Instead, Trump summoned Mr. Rosen to the Oval Office the next day. He wanted the Justice Department to file legal briefs supporting his allies' lawsuits seeking to overturn his election loss. And he urged Mr. Rosen to appoint special counsels to investigate not only unfounded accusations of widespread voter fraud, but also Dominion, the voting machines firm. Dominion, by the way, they note parenthetically here, has sued the pro-Trump lawyer, Sidney Powell, who inserted those accusations into 4 federal lawsuits about voter irregularities that were all dismissed. Mr. Rosen refused. He maintained that he would make decisions based on the facts and the law, and he reiterated what Mr. Barr had privately told Mr. Trump. The department had investigated voting irregularities and found no evidence of widespread fraud. But Mr. Trump continued to press Mr. Rosen after the meeting, in phone calls and in person. He repeatedly said that he did not understand why the Justice Department had not found evidence that supported conspiracy theories about the election that some of his personal lawyers had espoused. He declared that the department was not fighting hard enough for him. It's not supposed to. As Mr. Rosen and the Deputy Attorney General, Richard P. Donahue, there he is again, pushed back, they were unaware that Mr. Clark had been introduced to Mr. Trump by a Pennsylvania politician and had told the president that he agreed that fraud had affected the election results, even though, again, no evidence to that point had been turned up, and none likely to turn up in the future either. But remember, he bases everything on evidence, even if it's not there. Mr. Trump quickly, of course, embraced Mr. Clark, who had been appointed the acting head of the Civil Division in September, and was also the head of the department's Environmental and Natural Resources Division. What's he doing meddling in elections? I thought I could get ahead. He's not assuming. He's unassuming, don't you see? As December wore on, Mr. Clark mentioned to Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue that he spent a lot of time reading on the internet. Yeah, I would fire him right there. Like, what do you mean by that? A comment that alarmed them because they inferred that he believed the unfounded conspiracy theory that Mr. Trump had won the election. Mr. Clark also told them that he wanted the department to hold a news conference announcing that it was investigating serious accusations of election fraud. Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue rejected the proposal. I mean, it's the sort of thing that if you blurt it out in a meeting and they were like, what? No, you'd say, just kidding. But he wasn't. As Mr. Trump focused increasingly on Georgia, a state he lost narrowly to Mr. Biden, he complained to Justice Department leaders that the U.S. Attorney in Atlanta, Byung Jae Pak, or Pak, P-A-K, was not trying to find evidence for false election claims pushed by Mr. Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and others. Mr. Donahue warned Mr. Pak that the president was now fixated on his office and that it might not be tenable for him to continue to lead it, according to two people familiar with the conversation. So again, the big hero, Mr. Donahue here, not only witnessing crimes and writing it down in notes and then hiding it away until somebody asks him, hey, by the way, did you see any crime? Oh, you mean this crime, right? I have no gate key. All right. He finds out that the president is going to focus on him and their answer, wrongly focus on the U.S. Attorney in Atlanta. So he calls him and says, you might want to just resign. And I don't know how to take that. Is that like, you got to get out of here? Oh my God, it's just, you don't want any part of this. Leave as soon as possible. Or, well, the president's going to be focusing on you, and it's wrong. But by all means, you could say, don't do anything. Stand your ground. You got to stay there, because if you leave, God only knows who he's going to put in that job. Apparently, that's not the advice. That conversation and Mr. Trump's efforts to pressure Georgia's Republican Secretary of State to, quote, find him votes compelled Mr. Pak to abruptly resign this month. Mr. Clark was also focused on Georgia. He drafted a letter that he wanted Mr. Rosen to send to Georgia state legislators that wrongly said that the Justice Department was investigating accusations of voter fraud in their state and that they should move to void Mr. Biden's win there, because evidence is the only thing that moves him to action, and he's unassuming. He just walks into the acting attorney general's office and says, here, I want you to send this letter. And, Mr. Rosen's like, I want me not to send that letter. Who the F are you? You want me to send this letter. And it's a ridiculous assertion. But at the time, I'm sure Clark is secretly like, I'll bide my time, Mr. Rosen. But you'll be sorry you didn't send this letter when I become acting attorney general. You could just see it working in his head. Luckily, that never happened. But it came close. That's dangerous. Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue again rejected Mr. Clark's proposal. On New Year's Eve, the trio met to discuss Mr. Clark's refusal to hew to the department's conclusion that the election results were valid. Mr. Donahue flatly told Mr. Clark that what he was doing was wrong. But did he fire him? No. Did he let him, did he write him up? No. Does he have notes? Maybe. I don't know. The next day, Mr. Clark told Mr. Rosen, who had mentored him while they worked together at the law firm Kirkland & Ellis, that he was going to discuss his strategy with the president early the next week, just before Congress was set to certify Biden's electoral victory. Unbeknownst to the acting attorney general, Mr. Clark's timeline moved up. He met with Mr. Trump over the weekend, then informed Mr. Rosen midday on Sunday that the president intended to replace him with Mr. Clark, who could then try to stop Congress from certifying the Electoral College results. See, I told you, Mr. Rosen, I would arrange the whole thing. He said that Mr. Rosen could stay on as his deputy attorney general, leaving Mr. Rosen speechless. Unwilling to step down without a fight, Mr. Rosen said that he needed to hear straight from Mr. Trump and worked with the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, to convene a meeting for early that evening. Even as Mr. Clark's pronouncement was sinking in, stunning news broke out of Georgia. State officials had recorded an hour-long call published by the Washington Post during which Mr. Trump pressured them to manufacture enough votes to declare him the victor. As the fallout from the recording ricocheted through Washington, the president's desperate bid to change the outcome in Georgia came into sharp focus. Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue pressed ahead, informing Stephen Engel, the head of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, about Mr. Clark's latest maneuver. Mr. Donahue convened a late afternoon call with the department's remaining senior leaders, laying out Mr. Clark's efforts to replace Mr. Rosen. Mr. Rosen planned to soon head to the White House to discuss his fate, Mr. Donahue told the group. Should Mr. Rosen be fired, they all agreed to resign en masse. For some, the plan brought to mind the so-called Saturday Night Massacre of the Nixon era, when Attorney General Elliot Richardson and his deputy resigned rather than carry out the president's order to fire the special prosecutor investigating him. The Clark plan, the officials concluded, would seriously harm the department, the government, and the rule of law. Oh, is that all? For hours, they anxiously messaged and called one another as they awaited Mr. Rosen's fate. Around 6 p.m., Mr. Rosen, Mr. Donahue, and Mr. Clark met at the White House with Mr. Trump, Mr. Cipollone, his deputy Patrick Philbin, and other lawyers. Trump had Rosen and Clark present their arguments to him in the Apprentice, or The Bachelor for that matter. Mr. Cipollone advised the president not to fire Mr. Rosen, and he reiterated, as he had for days, that he did not recommend sending the letter to Georgia lawmakers. Mr. Engel advised Mr. Trump that he and the department's remaining top officials would resign if he fired Mr. Rosen, leaving Mr. Clark alone at the department. Mr. Trump seemed somewhat swayed by the idea that firing Mr. Rosen would trigger not only chaos at the Justice Department, but also congressional investigations and possible recriminations from other Republicans and distract attention from his efforts to overturn the election results. I think that Trump probably thought that would enhance his efforts to overturn the election results, not only because he would be able to install loyalists, but that he would be able to show the MAGA crowd, look, I'm fighting. He's fighting. Look, the captain is fighting the Americans, right? From, just a hopeless situation. But it would look like he was fighting hard. I'm really not so certain I believe this. After nearly 3 hours, Mr. Trump ultimately decided that Mr. Clark's plan would fail, and he allowed Mr. Rosen to stay. Mr. Rosen and his deputies concluded they had weathered the turmoil. Once Congress certified Mr. Biden's victory, there would be little for them to do until they left along with Mr. Trump in 2 weeks. They began to exhale days later as the Electoral College certification at the Capitol got underway, and then they received word. The building had been breached. And that's the end of this installment of this ongoing saga, but it was written a long time ago. It was back in January, and I guess we know what came next in terms of the news they received over the phone. But, wow, there's a lot of moving parts to this, and I gather that I think it would be wise at this point to go on record once again stating that there really can never, ever, ever be any state funeral for Donald J. Trump. What a ridiculous notion that would be. It doesn't matter when he dies, and I'm not willing to offer any deals on it either. We're past due on that account. Sorry, there's no opportunity to deal your way out of this one. There's much worse that should be happening to you at this point. Not letting you lie in state in the Capitol sack is probably the least we should be doing.
From networksradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, as they say. Hope you enjoyed today's shorter format. We're going to experiment with this during the hiatus and bring you what we bring you for the next 2 weeks. See you again tomorrow.